Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Chip Gibbons. I use he, him pronouns. This is our Socialist Night School on US sanctions as a weapon of war. We are recording this online and streaming on Facebook Live. I'm not sort of an expert at the technology of Zoom or Facebook, something I'm quickly becoming more and more of. So I don't know if you have your video on, if you'll be recorded or not. So if you don't want to be recorded or don't want to be on Facebook Live, I would definitely not have my video on. Tonight, we are discussing US sanctions as a weapon of war. This is obviously a very important topic. I know that for some people, we'll sometimes hear this discourse about US sanctions where they're proposed as sort of a non-violent or an alternative to US war. But the reality is that sanctions have deadly consequences for civilian populations and are used by the US to sort of punish or coerce or overthrow governments that disfavors. I first got started in sort of anti-war organizing around George W. Bush's invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I know there was sort of a lot of sort of contentious discussion about sanctions then. And what had happened was that the Clinton admitted after Iraq had invaded Kuwait in 1990, the UN Security Council had imposed sanctions on Iraq to try to get them to withdraw. They withdrew from Kuwait. The US and the UK both had veto power. They both kept the sanctions going. They then claimed it was to make Iraq disarm. Most likely the US knew Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction as early as 1992. And in 97, Clinton, when asked about the sanctions, said they would remain on Iraq until the end of time or the end of Saddam Hussein. And these sanctions were quite violent. One study showed that 570,000 children under the age of 5 died as a result of them. It's also worth taking into account that these sanctions were also accompanied by a lot of bombing by the US and the UK. Between the first Iraq war and the second Iraq war, the US never stops bombing Iraq. In 1999, we were bombing Iraq once every 3 days and spending $1 billion to do so. And a lot of that history gets sort of erased from sort of the history of Bush's war in Iraq. So I think that sanctions are always a really important topic. We actually planned this like 6 months ago, but it got sort of pushed back because we were working on something around the coup in Bolivia instead. And since then, the topic of sanctions has just become even more relevant because with the coronavirus, we know that these sanctions are made all the more deadly as countries do not have sort of the medical resources they need. I just want to say that this panel focuses on US sanctions, but I want to remind people that since 2007, the Gaza Strip has been under a blockade and siege by Israel. There are 1.9 million people living in Gaza. 1.4 million of them are refugees registered with the UN, and it is one of the most densely populated places on Earth, which makes it a particular problem for the spread of coronavirus, and that the siege and blockade of Gaza has absolutely brought their health system to the brink. So I would ask you to keep that in the back of your mind tonight as we talk about our own government's aggression. So who are our panelists? Keyvan Karzan is an Iranian American researcher at the Center for Economic Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Oh, I should introduce myself. I'm Chip Gibbons, he, him pronouns. I'm involved in political education in DC. I'm also co-chair of the National DSA's International Committee Anti-War Working Group. Like I was talking about Keyvan, he's an Iranian American researcher at the Center for Economic Policy and Research in Washington, D.C., where he has studied the humanitarian impacts of U.S. economic sanctions, along with their legal implications, both domestically and internationally. We're also joined by Kevin Cashman, who is a senior associate also at CEPR in Washington, D.C. And then we have Sarah Lazar, who is joining us from Chicago. One of the benefits of everything being online is we can bring in all of the speakers we always wanted to have, but they were not in DC. She's the web editor at In These Times. She also co-edited the book About Face, Military Resistors Turn Against War, and she got her start in journalism reporting for the Independent Media Center movement about US militarism. And then we have a member of Metro DC DSA's Internationalism Working Group, who will discuss the ongoing work by DSA activists against sanctions. I believe it's going to be Elliot Bacon. Elliot, are you on the call yet?
Chip. Yes, I am.
Oh, hello. Hello. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, and then after that, we're going to do questions and answers. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until after everyone is done presenting, and you can put them in the chat box and I will read them to the panelist. So we're going to start with the two comrades from the Center for Economic and Policy Research.
I can start. I guess I think going over mechanically how sanctions work and how they affect countries in normal times would be helpful. And then I think Kayvon can talk more about how they're affecting countries during the pandemic. So like you said, Chip, sanctions are unilateral coercive measures. We focus more of our work on what the US is doing, but also, like you said, the UN also has the ability to enact sanctions. And there has to be a Security Council vote. And like you said, you also need a vote to remove them. So in Iraq's case, it was difficult to remove the sanctions. And that was also something that the US intentionally did, which had, disastrous effects. But just talking about US sanctions, the US is unique in the world in its ability to sanction other countries, even countries that aren't trading with it or having financial transactions with it. And it does that in a couple ways. The first is that it controls a lot of the infrastructure in the international financial system. Two of the protocols for banks exchanging money, SWIFT and CHIPS, are both heavily influenced by the US, either by being controlled by US banks, being under US law, or in the case of SWIFT, which isn't under US law, the US has an agreement with the organization to get, I think it has access to every transaction that it processes. So the US basically can know if two other countries are trading or have any transactions together, even if it doesn't even touch a US bank. So in those respects, the US can pass a law or sanction Venezuela or Iran or another country, and then prevent third parties from doing any business with Iran or Venezuela. So that's a lot of power, and it does that through legal methods, but also putting a lot of pressure on banks. Banks are not, in this case, a bank, or most banks probably wouldn't want to do business with Iran, for example, if it's a small amount of their overall business, or if it's a risk to any part of the bank. So without assurances that the business they do with Iran meets US law, the bank rather just shut down all business it does with Iran. So that's sort of more like a soft power, if you will, approach. And that's just the threat of the US acting against these banks. And then the effect of that on countries like Iran or Venezuela is basically that they don't have banks in other countries that they can transact with. And what that means is they have a very difficult time exporting goods and getting foreign exchange. And without foreign exchange, they can't import goods. So if Iran is trying to export oil, it basically needs to find countries that want to buy its oil outside of the international financial system. And then it can't say it does business with China. It can't buy dollars with the money it gets from China. So it has to buy things from China with the renminbi that it got. So it severely limits the ability of a country to import the goods it needs. And in normal times, this affects everything, food, medicine, and during these times we've seen that it is affecting the same things, but the need for these items is even greater. So it's even more tragic. The US talks about these sanctions in different ways. With Iran, we've seen Trump say that, they have a maximum pressure campaign, and this is to basically cause regime change in the Iranian government. But you also have US officials that say, we have humanitarian exemptions for these sanctions, so we're not actually affecting the civilian population. We're just affecting, specific officials, or, we're preventing Iran from importing weapons or something like that. But what we've seen is that the humanitarian exemptions are very difficult to access, and the US doesn't really have an interest in making them easier to access. So it's very difficult to import medicine or to even use these exemptions. And a lot of nonprofits or other organizations talk to the US and try to access these mechanisms, but they don't really have any interest in making it easy to use them. Other countries, especially Europe, we'll just use Iran in the example, still want to trade with Iran. They like the Iran deal, which eliminated sanctions, and they set up a separate mechanism called inflict to do these humanitarian transactions. Before the pandemic, it was very difficult, even with this completely separate mechanism, to trade with Iran. And actually, during the pandemic, they've used it for the first time to import medicine or some other humanitarian supplies. So even though Europe is, a big place and has a lot of people and a lot of power in the world, they were still afraid to use this mechanism previously to basically skirt US sanctions, because they thought the US would sanction their banks or retaliate in some way. So that's a little bit about how sanctions work and the mechanisms by which they work. I don't know if, Kayvon, you want to talk about the pandemic and how that's changed things a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you've seen the news, Iran is one of the most hardest hit from the pandemic. There's about 3,800 deaths and 25,000 confirmed cases at least. There's a lot of lack of testing there right now. But yeah, so I mean, there's been an actual onslaught in the media about sanctions in Iran, which is something that we haven't seen before. It's kind of the consensus now, like New York Times, WAPO, their editorial teams have come out against it. Madeleine Albright headed a letter recently saying we should lift sanctions against Iran, which Madeleine Albright, she was the architect of the deadly Iraq sanctions that Chip was talking about. So it's pretty bad if Madeleine Albright is coming against and saying that sanctions have a humanitarian impact. But yeah, so I mean, like Kevin said, before the pandemic, there was already issues importing medical equipment and devices and medicines. Iran does have a domestic capacity to import medicine. To produce medicine. They make around 96 to 97% of their medicines, but it's that 3 or 4% that's the most crucial life-saving stuff. And then of that 97% of the medicines, some of them, all of them have like at least one element that is imported. So they may have 10 of the elements and missing one, and the whole medicine doesn't work. So it has a huge impact. But yeah, as far as imports in Iran, the State Department has been continuing their propaganda campaign, saying that there's no humanitarian impact. They just came out today with this horrible press release, line by line, basically blaming Iran for funding foreign, or their national security apparatus instead of domestically funding healthcare, which is pretty ironic coming from the State Department. But the reality is that it is harder to import medicines right now, specifically coronavirus, and very specifically too. So last year, the U.S. designated the Central Bank of Iran and the National Development Fund of Iran, which is their sovereign wealth fund, which they get much of their national income from. They designated them as terrorist organizations. So this is a one step further than the previous sanctions. They say that the Central Bank of Iran designated as a terrorist organization and therefore falls under certain sanctions provisions that go all the way back to 9/11 that Bush signed into law. And so before that, there was ostensibly a general license for some medicines, but when they did the terrorist designation, that eliminated all trade with the Central Bank of Iran, which of course is like the key component to getting foreign reserves within the country to buy and import medicines. And all the other private banks in Iran, public and private, that handle importing and exporting in Iran, they're still under sanctions. I believe, let me get this right, the end of February, the State Department came out to do a general license called General License 8, and they came out with a thing and they said that there's a general license to import medicines and medical supplies to Iran, humanitarian exemption, which is on the books from other banks as well, but specifically to counter this terrorist designation. If you go in and look at the actual general license, you can see that it says, there's an asterisk there and it says, except for, and there's a list of other medical devices you can click to. There's a page. I can share that later. Specifically on that list of things that you need a special license for, PCR machines, which is the main component to do the PCR tests, which is the main way of testing for COVID-19, ventilators, oxygen equipment, decontamination equipment, decontaminate showers, and different things to decontaminate medical supply. Those are specifically on a list that you need a special license for, which is incredibly difficult to get. I mean, even under the general license, it's hard to get. So just as an example, the latest data we have was from the Treasury Department, January to March 2019. There are 22 applications specifically in Iran to import, to get medical devices to Iran. 2 of those were granted. The average time that it takes for a license to be granted is about 77 days. So let's just say that, there are humanitarian exemptions right now, and there is a process that is quick, or not quick, but is functioning. You can go to OFAC and you can apply for a license. That means it would take 77 days to get life-saving equipment to fight COVID-19 right now. So, I mean, it's complete fabrication. It's a complete lie from the State Department when they say there's no humanitarian exemptions. I mean, it's specifically targeted there. Also, general licenses capped at $500,000 too. So, in the State Department has said they created this channel, a Swiss banking channel as well, that they claim is their remedy for this situation, which is funny because if you have to go out of your way to create a channel for humanitarian trade, it means that sanctions affect humanitarian trade. So they kind of it's a self-defeating argument there. And they've processed I think 1 or 2 shipments of medical supplies to Iran. But there's export lawyers and different companies they say that it's way too stringent of the process to actually go through with the Swiss banking channel. First, they have to have an account at the Swiss bank, and second, they have to divulge all this sensitive information. Like any Iranian firm that wants to import medicine, they have to give them a list of, going back 2 or 3 years of every single person they had contact with. I mean, all their financial, all this stuff, which, I read it, they're talking about it's a fishing expedition basically for future sanctions. You're basically handing over the State Department all this information, and let's say the pandemic stops, and then the U.S. has a huge list and a huge network of what they can target next. So that's why it hasn't really been working. And then Instex, what Kevin was talking about, that the Europeans started building last year, despite bullying and explicit threats from the Trump administration to not do it. They did their first shipments through that last week for about 500,000. So I mean, that's not really that much. So yeah, I mean, the Iran situation is really bad. And I mean, it's not just Iran. I've studied most of it, so that's why I'm talking mostly about Iran. Another tidbit is that the personal protective equipment has fallen from 39 million euros of imports from Europe to 13 million, and that span is when the sanctions stopped and ended. So because Iran has a really big problem with it right now, I think we have the case study of what can happen in other countries. And I just want to briefly mention Venezuela. Right now, we don't really have that much information. We know there's cases there right now. And similar with Iran, actually even more so because they don't have this domestic industry for a lot of their medical equipment. I mean, they really face a huge, huge crisis. And I don't know if people saw, but recently, the U.S., the Trump administration just put a bounty on Nicolas Maduro's head right in the middle of a pandemic. And they issued a statement that basically, outlined basically like a new transition constitution for Venezuela. And they basically said you have to create a junta that's based on all of these criteria. And once you do that, then we'll relieve sanctions. And it's just really naked U.S. imperialism. And yeah, so there's a lot of fears that if it starts spreading there, they have even a harder time importing things because their national economy has taken even a bigger hit as far as funding because of the oil sanctions. And I mean, because there's also been a refugee crisis, a migrant crisis due to U.S. economic warfare. This has the possibility of spreading. If Venezuela becomes a hotspot, this is going to spread throughout all of Latin America. Even though most of Latin American countries have cases, just like a outpouring of more refugees or migrants to countries that already cannot handle their own situation. It's going to cause some really horrible consequences. And Colombia already is facing that right now. And there's been horrible cases of xenophobia against Venezuelan migrants who are left basically to be on the street. They don't have places for them to sleep. So yeah, there's been a lot of people that have come out against the sanctions. The UN General Secretary, 34 Congress people in the US, some senators, and they all vary for what they actually call for. From lifting, just completely lifting them right now, to a pause, to targeted lifting, to creating humanitarian channels. So they're all different things. I personally think that anything short of full lifting, nothing's going to change unless you not only fully lift it, but you have to actively bridge these financial channels that you've destroyed over the past few years, especially with Iran. Even if you lift it tomorrow, these companies that already are cash strapped, already facing this crisis, all these medical companies, they're not going to just decide overnight to risk everything and to get the lawyers and to get, put all of their staff into figuring out how are we going to bridge these channels. So, really a solution for this is the Trump administration actually actively creating financial channels, issuing letters of comfort, which are basically, they're letters to companies that say, it's okay to do this and we're not going to come after you and we're not going to fine you billions of dollars. because you have to remember when we're talking about all the actors that are involved in the supply chain and sanctions, we're not just talking about a buyer and a seller. We're talking about insurers. We're talking about shipping containers. We're talking like a whole slew of different entities along that way. And you just need one of them in that chain to be afraid and the whole thing collapses. So really there needs to be a concerted effort to bring this back. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions about that later. But I think Sarah's going to talk more about domestic
Yeah,
politics.
can I just ask one quick question abusing my authority as moderator real quick?
Yeah.
Is there an estimate of how many people have died in Venezuela because of the sanctions? Like, is there an NGO who has put out a
Yes.
study
Yes.
on the, and what
Yeah,
NGO
I
would
forgot
that
about
be?
that. Yeah. So Mike Weisbrot, our CEPRS co-director, and the economist Jeffrey Sachs last year came out with a report estimating about 40,000 people have died. And this was just, last spring, up to last spring from US sanctions. And I mean, undoubtedly that number has risen and risen as the situation has gotten worse and worse in Venezuela. So if that's a normal time, without a pandemic, I really can't imagine what a pandemic situation under sanctions would be like.
Yeah, and I will go to Sarah in just a second. I will just abuse my moderator's privilege one more time by pointing out that, like, I didn't know Madeleine Albright had called for the Iran sanctions to be lifted, but one of the reasons that's so amazing is that in the 90s, she went on 60 Minutes and she was asked, like, we have heard 500,000 children have died under the age of 5 in Iraq because of the sanctions. That's more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Do you think the price is worth it? And she just sits there without any pause and goes, yes, we think the price is worth it, which you can contrast to Bill Clinton's very belligerent response when he made the mistake of calling to Democracy Now! For a get out the vote drive, and Amy Goodman started asking him about that, which if you've never heard that, I would highly recommend doing so. So that brings us to Sarah.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
I can hear you loud and, oh, you moved.
I did. I thought the lighting was better here. So. Well, it's really great to be talking with you all about such a critically important, incredibly high stakes issue. So what I want to do is zoom in specifically on Iran sanctions and look at not just the role of the Trump administration in brutally escalating these sanctions, but also the complicity of Democrats, because I think we have to really understand both if we're going to understand how we got here and what we're up against. So a big touchstone for me was in the summer of 2017, there was a vote to bundle in sanctions against Iran, Russia, and North Korea. It was sort of during peak Russiagate when every, Democrat who wanted to prove that they were going to stick it to Trump was, jockeying the show how tough they were on Putin. And by attaching it to anti-Russia rhetoric, Democrats overwhelmingly got behind this bill. The only person who caucuses with Democrats to vote no on the bill that imposed new sanctions on Iran was Bernie Sanders. Elizabeth Warren voted yes. Barbara Lee voted yes. And the sanctions targeting Iran were supposed to be specifically targeted at the ballistic weapon system. But what we saw is that was very much a precursor to Trump withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal and escalating sanctions dramatically. And also sort of along the lines of what Kayvon was talking about, it had the impact of spooking companies from doing business with Iran. I actually spoke with someone who lives in Washington, D.C., who's really involved in the End COVID sanctions campaign, which I'm pretty sure DSA is also a part of and sort of involves a lot of anti-war organizations. His name is Kayvon Shafi, and his father actually passed away in Iran in October of 2017 because he couldn't get the treatment he needed due to sanctions. And Kayvon described a lot of other people who were in a similar boat. He spent a lot of time in the hospital talking with people who were desperately concerned for their loved ones because they were being told by doctors that critical medical supplies were not available. But so that is really horrible. It continues to bother me that the Democrats who voted for that don't get more scrutiny. I think that they really deserve to be held accountable and to be pressed for an apology and for sort of a public accounting. But Democrats' complicity with the sanctions regime on Iran goes back very far. Actually, Kayvon from CEPR was someone whose research I really leaned on a lot to write about this. So he's a wealth of information about this. But the 1976 International Emergency Powers Act was passed by a Democratic-controlled House and Senate. And it allows the president to declare a national emergency and impose sanctions without putting them to a congressional vote. President Jimmy Carter was the first to invoke the act against Iran in response to the Iranian hostage crisis, and all 6 subsequent administrations, including all the Democrats, have done so as well. And it's this framework that creates the present day justification for the Trump administration's devastating sanctions on Iran. One person who deserves a lot of credit for pushing against this is Ilhan Omar, who before the COVID outbreak began was working on legislation to sort of make it so that Congress and not the president imposes sanctions. But it wasn't just a procedural ask. She's also been very clear about opposing U.S. sanctions on Iran. So as we all know, Trump pulled out of the Iran deal in 2018, and ever since has been ratcheting up sanctions, and this has gone along with all sorts of terrifying brinksmanship and warmongering. This is no surprise. He's surrounded himself with, anti-Iran fanatics from day one. But it's been really scary to see that there has not been a sizable group of Democrats willing to forcefully challenge him on this. And so his march towards brutal economic sanctions it's not been a political priority of Democrats to stop that. So since the global pandemic began, there has been a bit more noise around the urgency of ending US sanctions on Iran. So I'm sure many of you saw the open letter released on March 31st from 34 members of Congress. It was led by Omar and Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez. So their demand, so I'm just going to read from it, is so it's to the Treasury Secretary demanding they substantially suspend sanctions on Iran during this global public health emergency and a humanitarian gesture to the Iranian people to better enable them to fight the virus. And they say that sanctions relief should encompass major sectors of the Iranian economy, including those impacting civilian industries, Iran's banking sector, and exports of oil, and should last for at least as long as health experts believe the crisis will continue. And actually it included a lot of signatories, some of whom voted for sanctions in 2017. Actually, Elizabeth Warren and Barbara Lee both signed on to this letter, which is of course better than doing nothing, but with no apology for having voted for sanctions in 2017. It's really useful to sort of look at the specific demands lawmakers are issuing and compare what they're saying. Biden was asked about his position on Iran sanctions by Chuck Todd on March 29th, and he weirdly had nothing to say. I don't know if anyone saw the clip or saw the text from the interaction, but it was very bizarre. He just sort of incoherently brushed Chuck Todd off. He later, on April 2nd, came out with a statement, and I'm going to read to you from that statement too. So he says that the US should take steps that include issuing broad licenses to pharmaceutical and medical device companies, creating a dedicated channel for international banks, transportation companies, insurers, and other service firms to help Iranians access life-saving medical treatment, issuing new sanctions guidance to these groups and international aid organizations to make it clear how they can immediately, directly, and legally respond to the tragedy in Iran without fear of penalty. Basically, there's a really big focus not on lifting sanctions or ending sanctions, but having clearer guidelines and having better humanitarian channels. This is something that we saw Menendez and Engel call for as well. I don't know if y'all saw the statement that Menendez issued, but it was very hawkish. It was like qualified by saying, you know, the sanctions are justified, Iran is infinitely evil, sanctions are necessary to, you know, get people to rise up against the regime, and but we should have some humanitarian channels and have clearer guidelines. So it was kind of the same thing that Biden said, more or less, but couched in even more warmongering rhetoric. You know, I would argue that it isn't a time that it's important to be very, very clear that anything short of ending sanctions is going to continue the problem. So clearer guidelines or claiming that there are humanitarian pathways. I mean, the Trump administration already claims that it has clear guidelines and already claims that there's a humanitarian pathway. But as long as a sanctions regime exists, any humanitarian goods will be profoundly under threat. So there has been a small army of right-wing lobby organizations that have, while this crisis has been ongoing, pushing for Iran sanctions to be tightened. FDD gets a top prize for just, you know, bloodthirstiness and viciousness. I've been checking their website every day, and they have written numerous articles, you know, saying that it's a lie that humanitarian goods aren't getting in, that sanctions are justified. They're clearly making a really big effort in favor of Iran sanctions. They're very tied in with the Trump administration. They exert a huge influence, and potentially that could be part of the reason why the Trump administration decided to tighten sanctions in the midst of the coronavirus crisis. AIPAC, not shockingly, has been a big supporter of Iran sanctions. Menendez, whose quote I just read from, spoke recently at the AIPAC 2020 conference. But there's one think tank that I think deserves special scrutiny because they're the most influential think tank among Democrats, and that's the Center for American Progress. So on March 12th, when the coronavirus crisis was sort of in full gear at that point, Brian Katulis, a senior fellow at CAP, and Peter Jewell, a senior policy analyst for CAP, they co-authored a piece on the CAP website calling for limited sanctions relief in exchange for opening a new dialogue with Iran, similar to an interim deal crafted in 2013 that preceded the negotiations to the Iran nuclear deal. That is a horrifying proposal, this idea that Iran gets limited sanctions relief and only as a concession for a new nuclear deal. There's a crisis right now. The idea that a Trump administration would negotiate a nuclear deal that was anything close to just or even just providing relief for the Iranian people is laughable. That wasn't the only thing that they wrote. So there was another piece written by the same authors, and it was published on March 11th. And this one is even worse. So they say, so that, you know, they acknowledge that US sanctions are providing difficulties for some goods to get through. And then they say, at the same time, however, this diplomacy first alternative also understands that the United States can't simply return to the 2015 international nuclear deal with Iran either. Instead, they argue for a new interim deal that addresses, quote, the legitimate security concerns of America's Middle East partners, including implementing Obama's era security cooperation agreements with the Gulf Arab states. So the US is helping So that's a reference to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. CAP until recently took UAE funding, and Brian Katulis, the co-author of those pieces, he is known for his close relationship with the UAE. He was continuing to meet regularly with UAE lobbyists long after CAP said that it had stopped taking money from them. And as I'm sure everyone knows, the US is working with Saudi Arabia and UAE to launch a brutal war in Yemen that is now 5 years old. The coalition has not let up despite the coronavirus crisis. There have been airstrikes throughout, largely with US weapons. So this idea that limited sanctions relief would have to hitch its carriage to protecting the security of the UAE and Saudi Arabia is just a very warmongering thing to say. It's treating people in Iran who are suffering like they don't matter. The people being hurt most are people who are poor, who are vulnerable, who are marginalized. And it's a real catastrophe. It's just horrifying. And it's really scary to see that Democratic Party institutions are just so far from where we need to be, which is we're issuing the unqualified, urgent demand that sanctions immediately be lifted. Okay, I don't want to be too depressing. I mean, there are a lot of people mobilizing around this. There are huge coalitions. I've been really excited about the End COVID Sanctions Coalition. It includes a lot of really great anti-war organizations, a lot of sort of like independent Iranian Americans who are in touch with their families and hearing really horrible news and trying to do their best to get the US government to provide some relief and, take its boot off of the neck of people in Iran. So I'm hoping to hear more about that campaign and others from other folks on this call.
So Elliot, I guess that takes us right into what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chip. Hi, everyone. My name is Elliot. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a member of Metro DC DSA and specifically the Internationalism Working Group, which builds peace and socialism around the world through international solidarity. We started, the working group started about 1.5 years ago with the Venezuela embassy defense. Many of you may remember the attempted coup, the US-sponsored coup of Juan Guaido. As part of that, there was an attempt to take over the Venezuelan embassy here in Washington, D.C. A large coalition of groups, including DSA members, were involved in defending that building, essentially. And so they, as part of that, started the Internationalism Working Group to have a specific focus on these issues. We are focusing on sanctions as our main campaign in the working group. We recently co-sponsored a talk hosted by Trita Parsi with Code Pink. Trita Parsi is the co-founder of the Quincy Institute and a leading voice on Iranian-American relations and a leading critic of US foreign policy towards Iran. We are also working with the DSA National International Committee on their anti-sanctions campaign, which has accelerated given all the horrors that we're seeing due to the coronavirus pandemic. We supported NYC DSA, who had a campaign going to garner support for the letter, which Sarah mentioned, written by Ilhan Omar and supported by AOC, Bernie Sanders, and others. And we have endorsed Ilhan Omar's Pathway to Peace bill, which I believe was also mentioned as a comprehensive set of bills meant to reshape US foreign policy. One of those is specifically geared towards ending US executive branch unilateral ability to control sanctions. We want to both continue to grow our work in DC, but connect with other DSA branches and other organizations in this anti-sanctions effort around the country. So we hope that people are interested in getting involved. I've got a couple of different ways you can get in contact with us. I'll also put these in the chat so you don't have to write them down. If you are a member of Metro DC DSA and on Slack, we are #internationalism. You can email us at internationalism@mdcdsa.org. And our Twitter is at INTL, abbreviated international _solidarity. Happy to take questions if people have them. Hope people are interested in getting involved more, either with Metro DC DSA or with your local chapter of DSA or one of the many other groups that are also working on this effort.
And if anyone wants to get involved with the national DSA's international committees, anti-war, so many words,
It's a mouthful.
too many words. I'm happy to get you on that list or in that subcommittee. It is the international committee is not open, but the subcommittees of it are open to all DSA members. So if you are a DSA member in good standing, you are more than welcome to join us in the anti-war subcommittee. I won't leave the first part of that off. And I can get you on the list. We recently endorsed the no sanctions campaign, so things are moving. So this brings us to Q&A. We have about an hour for Q&A. So I hope you have plenty of questions. The first question I see is there any initiative in Congress to cancel sanctions against Venezuela?
I can talk a little. I mean, we already mentioned that Omar bill, the COSA that she came out with in February, that's not specifically targeted at Venezuela sanctions, nor does it automatically lift sanctions. But what it does is it puts a sunset date on all of the national emergency declarations that are currently in place. I believe there's 25 of them in place. That is the basis for sanctions. So, so the national emergency that Obama actually started against Venezuela, that would have a sunset. And I'm not sure the exact date. I believe it's 60 days from when it gets passed, but I could be wrong. And then after that, Congress would have to then Trump can do a new one against Venezuela, and then that would be 60 days with the sunset, and then Congress would have to do a joint resolution to continue that. So it's a roundabout way of ending the sanctions, because you're not actually ending the sanctions, nor you're guaranteeing, because there's a lot of regime change Democrats as well, so there probably is still a majority to continue sanctions against Venezuela, but it just puts a little bit more roadblocks and congressional control over the executive's ability to unilaterally impose these through national emergencies. But I don't know specifically of a bill against sanctions against Venezuela. Maybe others do.
Sure. So if you have questions, put them in the chat box. I actually have a question. I know Sarah mentioned that one of the Democratic elected leaders had mentioned now is a good time for sanctions because it would encourage the population to rise up. What is the logic of sanctions? Like, how do they seek to achieve regime change? And are they deliberately designed to target civilian populations?
Yeah, so the whole logic behind US sanctions is a very violent, twisted logic that is totally disproven and also like highly, highly lethal. Pompeo has even sort of, I wish I had the exact quote in front of me, but I think a few months ago, he said something to the effect of, we're going to make the Iranian people suffer so badly that they rise up against their government and overthrow it. So it's this idea that if you starve people, deny them medicine, leave them destitute, take away all of the infrastructure they need to survive and thrive, they're going to somehow rise up and overthrow official US enemies. As we've seen, what happens is that people die in large numbers.
So we're targeting civilians who live under governments we claim are abusive, in hopes that by abusing the civilians, they'll get rid of the government that is abusing them. Is that Is that's
about it.
That's very logical. Big thinkers in the foreign policy establishment.
Yeah.
I would
Our
just
next question is, well, yeah.
I would just add one point too, is that, say you had a sanctions regime that actually genuinely allowed humanitarian aid in, so medicine, whatever, food, say if that worked, you're still basically crippling the economy. So how is that country going to buy that food? How is it going to buy that medicine if it can't export oil in Venezuela's case? So even if you had all these humanitarian exemptions and they try to say that these, would work, if somebody lost their job, they can't afford the things that they need to buy. That's basically the point.
Kayvon, do you have a thought or?
Yeah, I was just going to add very quickly, that's a great point, especially thinking about when we think about the pandemic right now, we also have to think about the huge global economic crisis that is occurring, especially in developing countries. And the fallout from this is going to be huge. And, in the case of Iran, for example, just the foreign exchange keeps diminishing. They're pulling from a lot of their reserves to fight COVID-19 right now. And oil prices has been tanking as well. So when things level off, when the curves flattened, they're going to be left with a huge balance of payments crisis. They're going to have no foreign reserves. They're going to have barely any exports because it'll take a long time to redo global shipping. So, it really will compact the economic side of sanctions.
So Elliot, do you have anything you want to add, or should I go to the next question?
No, not on that. Not on that.
Okay. So questions are actually pouring in now. That's good. I was a little bit nervous for about 30 seconds, but now we have a lot of questions, so I'm nervous in the other direction of getting through them all. From Dan, have any other countries ever used sanctions as a weapon anywhere near the degree the U.S. has? If so, what happened to those sanctions?
I can try to answer. I'm not aware of any country doing that. Possibly historically, when the British pound was more dominant, but really they only work because the world demands dollars, and that happens for a number of reasons, and that gives the U.S. its power, and because it controls the infrastructure too. So. Another country could certainly sanction Iran, say Belgium decides to sanction Iran. Everybody could just ignore Belgium. It would still hurt Iran probably a little bit, but it would be nowhere near the same impact because the US can basically force third parties into complying with what it wants to do.
Okay, the next question is so I guess I would be curious. I mean, clearly Israel is not sanctioning Gaza, but they are putting them under a blockade that denies them medicine, food. I mean, could that be said to be sort of analogous in at least intent and effect, like a military blockade, or is that too much of a stretch?
I mean, I can start this off. I mean,
okay.
I think that a good way to draw parallels is to look at the impact and intentions behind a policy rather than the sort of legal specifics. And I think that when you are cutting off a country sort of economically and militarily to the extent that Israel with US support is doing to Gaza, a really good parallel to that is just what's happening in Yemen right now, with the sort of ongoing bombardments, targeting hospitals, a center for the blind, factories, residential areas, bridges, combined with the naval blockade that the US has sent naval ships to support. But I think that these are all on the same sort of spectrum of the US imposing its military empire on the rest of the world, and that what's happening in Iran, while the technicalities are a little different, stems from the same sort of US imperial project.
Yeah, and I know with both the Gaza blockade and U.S. sanctions against Iraq in the 90s, I don't know if this is true with Iran or Venezuela, since they were supposedly around disarming, blocking them from receiving dual-use technologies was a huge part of them. And a lot of medical technology, dual use means a technology that can have either a civilian use or a military use. Dual use technology applies to a lot of medical equipment. I also know in the Iraq sanctions, pencils were dual use technologies because graphite can also, or lead can also be used to make bullets. So these really sort of extreme examples. So I do feel like there's some sort of parallel with what Israel's doing to Gaza and what the US did to Iraq in the 90s. And Israel and the US are, of course, very good at exchanging worst practices. I mean, like in the early 2000s, Israel was engaging in targeted killings, and the Bush administration said, this is illegal under international law. And then when Obama started doing targeted killings, he said, oh, this is legal. Look at this opinion from the Israelis. So great exchange of bad practices. So the next question is from Code Pink, I believe is probably from Medea. Sarah, do you think who do you think we should target? Is Nancy Pelosi a good target? Is it kind of impossible to target Congress during the crisis at home? And then no, there is no bill regarding sanctions on Venezuela.
That's a good question, who we should target. I don't know. I want to be honest that it's a really hard question. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are very powerful people. They're both very bad on this, especially Chuck Schumer, who's very close with AIPAC. I think, yes, we should target them. We should target everyone. I'm not a political strategist who's prepared to say where there's the most room to make progress. I will say that anyone who calls themselves a progressive or is currying the favor of the left and is not strong on this should catch hell for doing that. That was one of my arguments when Elizabeth Warren was running for president. It's something that I think the Congressional Progressive Caucus can be pushed on. They have not prioritized ending Iran sanctions. So I do think that there needs to be a standard for what it means to call yourself progressive, and that standard has to include ending lethal economic sanctions.
Elliot, do you know who some of the people who are being targeted in DSA by the No Sanctions campaign? Or is it too early to either nationally or in other chapters? It doesn't have to be in DC, just.
So in historically, or in the past several months, it has been members of Congress, generally Democratic, who, as Sarah says, sort of at least claim to be progressive or want to curry favor with the left to get reelected. And so it's been on a branch by branch basis. Members of Congress listen to people in their districts far more than they do to people who are not in their districts. For Metro DC DSA, our focus then unfortunately has to be on members of Congress from Virginia and Maryland because of DC's disenfranchisement, unfortunately.
Sure. And if there's no other answers here, I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay. This is from Bert. I'm from San Francisco DSA. Thanks for doing this great webinar. There are several different anti-sanctions campaigns going on. It's hard to keep track of them. Is there a way to help get them to converge or coordinate? I will just jump in and say that as co-chair of the anti-war subcommittee at the national level, this is a huge part of what we're trying to do, is to coordinate what different locals are doing on a national level and share resources and best practices and make sure we're all on the same page. Do you have thoughts on that, Elliot? And then anyone else can jump in to some PPSA things.
I was going to say the same thing, Chip. I mean, that from our perspective, that's what that group exists for, and that's why we're excited to be getting more involved with it. So I think for DSA, that's absolutely the place to start. Part of what we're going to do is be in-depth research to have sort of the research firepower, have communications that can be shared out to branches, chapters, working groups, and then also do outreach to different working groups and help them targeting a member of Congress who might be a good potential member for this, or other actions that we look to take. We don't want to just confine it to asking Congress to do things for us, though that has been thus far the main avenue that we have taken.
Sure. Do any of the other panelists want to hop in there, or do you feel satisfied with the DSA-centric approach to activism on this Socialist Night School? That sounds like a no. So Curtis, I have heard distinctions made on the news about sanctions on a country versus sanctions on individuals. Is there a difference in direct consequences to the working class in these countries between these types of sanctions?
I can try to take that. I think, as Sarah was saying, the only reason why sanctions work is because they kill civilians. They put pressure on, or the sanctions don't work, but the logic behind it is that they kill civilians, put pressure on the government, and cause a regime change. And that's how they, quote unquote, work. We know they don't work. They just kill civilians. So when people like Mike Pompeo or Brian Hook, in charge of Iran sanctions, make this distinction between individuals and the country, they're really just, it's a sleight of hand because they don't care about any individuals that don't have any power. It might be a nice PR thing for them to do if there was somebody unconnected to the government that they sanction. But if they sanction the head of the central bank, they can say they're only sanctioning this one person, but the head of the central bank has to sign off on documents. They have to sign off on transactions with other countries. They have to conduct transactions with the IMF or any other international organization. So that's where the pressure comes on, is that these individuals have power within the government. So the distinction in my mind is not, as far as how we should think about them, it's not an important distinction.
Anyone else, or?
Yeah, I'll just hop on just a little bit on that. Just like we were talking before, when usually like these individual designations usually are precursor to larger sectoral sanctions. So it kind of signals to the international business community as well that further sanctions are coming, or the US is going to be a little bit more vigilant on your trade relations. So a lot of companies will just take that as, as an excuse to exit the market and prepare themselves for possible fallout. I think that's sort of the case right now in Nicaragua. There's been a lot of, quote unquote, targeted individual sanctions. And I think that's ramping up into a larger push of sanctions against that country as well.
So Medea has mentioned, good point, Kevin. Countries need money now to help their citizens with oil prices tanking. Both Venezuela and Iran are in trouble. And then a question from David is, to what extent is Russian and Chinese aid subverting the US-EU sanction regime against Iran and Venezuela?
I can talk a little bit on, I guess, at least Iran. China still is pretty much the only importer of Iranian oil, but it's at a huge fraction of what it used to import. It tanked a lot. And right now they actually aren't even, Iran's not even getting revenue from new revenue from that right now. They're actually just paying off old debts for infrastructure investment and various other projects. And in Venezuela as well, Rosneft, the Russian oil and gas company, they had been skirting sanctions by kind of switching different subsidiaries of who is in charge of shipping and importing oil from Venezuela. But I think very recently Rosneft pulled out of a huge shipment of oil. And so, I mean, to some extent, I mean, there is aid right now, direct aid, bringing in equipment. Chinese equipment is coming to Iran, doctors, same with Venezuela, with, Cuba and Russia and all that. But that's not really subverting the sanctions regime so much. It's better than nothing, but you know, at the end of the day, these countries as well, like Russia and China, they still have to conduct international business and all that stuff. And there's going to be a lot of repercussions for them. So, I mean, I wish a coalition of countries would do a little bit more. Like some of the EU countries have tried to do that Instex mechanism, but I think there needs to be kind of a concerted effort, not just to like minimize sanctions right now, but think of long term. How do you subvert the US, you know, dollar dominance over the entire economy so that there are channels in the future so that you don't have to rely on the, you know, New York Federal Reserve Bank to conduct, you know, 60% of international transactions or whatever it is.
Sure. So Medea remarks that in Iran, they're talking about 40 to 50% unemployment because of sanctions, COVID and oil prices down, horrific. So then there's a really interesting conversation going on in the chat that gets to a question that I've had to ponder a lot and that we've been thinking about at in the National Anti-War Subcommittee. Someone remarked that the only example of good sanctions they could think of are against apartheid South Africa. Someone else mentioned BDS against Israel. And this is a question that I know comes up in DSA from time to time, which is that, is there a distinction between the type of sanctions that Palestinian civil society has called for against Israeli apartheid and the type of economic sanctions that the US puts on disfavored countries in order to implement regime change? Or are those the same? And how do we distinguish?
I can take this one to start us off. There is a tremendous difference between the biggest military empire humanity has ever seen imposing strangling sanctions on a country and the poor and oppressed of a country asking the world to impose sanctions on a government to protect them. The former is very bad, and the latter can be a tool for liberation as long as the demand is coming from those who are, you know, trodden down and dispossessed and oppressed, and who are leading a progressive call for liberation. And you know, in 2005, across the board, Palestinian civil society organizations called for boycott, divestment, sanctions of Israel, modeled after the campaign that toppled apartheid in South Africa. And they are in a position where they are bombed, they are occupied, protest is met with lethal violence, you know, threats of prosecution, martial law, you know, danger of being thrown in prison if you're Palestinian, and depending on the circumstances, if you're Israeli too, if you're protesting the occupation. So Palestinians are truly up against the wall, and so they are forced into a position where they are asking the, you know, global supporters around the world to use their positions to exert pressure on the occupying Israeli government. And, you know, one of the signs that BDS is making inroads and is potentially an effective tactic is the extent to which Israel is cracking down on it with US support, not only in Israel, not only in Palestine, but also in the US, where there are increasing political efforts to criminalize BDS. So I think it's really important to distinguish those. I think it's really good to be thoughtful and to like ask really deep, hard questions about what is the difference and how can we, you know, be sure that we're discerning those differences. But I think the differences are vast.
Yeah, and I would also note that, like in the case of South Africa, the call for sanctions came from Black South Africans, right? People who were living in the country. I also feel like there is like a distinction between like the types of economic sanctions the US imposes designed to inflict harm on a civilian population in order to topple a government versus like, you know, calls from South Africans to, you know, not let South Africa be in the International Rugby League. Or I feel like the big center for sanctions with BDS is around with, I'm being joined by Marcus, is around with an arms embargo, right? And saying like, you can't have guns is not the same as like driving people to die from lack of medicine. Like, I don't think like huge numbers of people died from like the sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And I would argue that's because they're a very different thing than what we mean about when we talk about sanctions in this context. Kevin or Kayvon, do you have thoughts, or Elliot?
I think you both put it very well. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I would just say that the power dynamics are different, and you're talking about situations where colonized people are asking for help.
Agreed.
All right, we're all okay with BDS. Code Pink has said, I think it's Medea, both Venezuela and Iran have asked the IMF for emergency loans to combat the coronavirus. Has the US blocked those loans?
If you read in between the lines, the U.S. did block them because there's a dispute about who the rightful leader of Venezuela is, believe it or not, among IMF countries. So that was the IMF's rationale for not giving this emergency loan, although I'm sure the U.S. would have tried to block it another way. So that's another example of the U.S. sort of using its power in this international financial system.
Any other responses to that? So, are there any other means of combating U.S. sanctions that don't involve putting pressure on elected officials in the U.S.? If so, what are some effective tactics that someone living in the U.S. can engage with? We've talked about some useful coalitions and groups that are doing good work, but I'm specifically wondering about work that doesn't rely on the goodwill of people in power. And this is from Nicole Sheher.
I'm not,
Oh,
I'm
why
sorry.
don't you go first? No, you go first.
Okay.
And I'll go.
So I think that's an excellent question. I think a couple points. So first, I would say that we are not hoping for the goodwill of elected officials. We are relying on their interest in getting reelected and making them feel threatened that if they do not support what we want, we will work against a primary challenger or campaign against them otherwise. And so it's not necessarily anything to do with altruism. We don't necessarily believe that these people are altogether altruistic. I do think that when it comes to sort of non-governmental actions, that's a challenge because the US government sort of is the one imposing these sanctions. I think there are charity and mutual aid efforts out there, but again, because of the sanctions, it's difficult to get significant funds or other means of aid into Iran, and a lot of organizations aren't willing to do so, again, because of the power of the US government and the dollar. I think there are also Iranian and American activists who have done more work in that sector, would be better equipped to answer further than I am able to.
I just wanted to make a sort of general pitch for building left movements that really prioritize and center anti-imperialism and internationalism. I think we're living through a really interesting and scary moment in time where there is a resurgent left that has captured the national stage and has forced millions of people and powerful politicians to grapple with left-wing ideas, whether it's the idea that we should have universal single-payer healthcare, or whether it's the idea that we should have a Green New Deal that involves sort of a dramatic economy-wide mobilization to address the climate crisis and to eradicate poverty and to protect good union jobs. But I don't think that attention to how the US is affecting people around the world has quite kept pace with that. And I do think there's a bit of a need to make sure that none of our domestic gains are made on the backs of other people, and that our demands to sort of take care of the well-being and interests of people in the US are coupled right alongside demands that the US stop perpetrating the harm that it's perpetrating around the world. You know, the US has considerable baggage around left and progressive movements that prioritize domestic gains while pursuing war. I think Lyndon B. Johnson, the architect of sort of the war on poverty, and also the architect of horrible escalations in the Vietnam War, is a very clear example of that. You know, he even said that he was exporting the Great Society to Vietnam as part of his PR justification for US atrocities in Vietnam. So I think that there's just sort of a general need to build consciousness around how critical it is to make sure that our gains here at home are not one on the backs of anyone else. And I think events like this are actually really important for the long-term goal of building those kinds of movements.
Okay, some more. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I always think of how the Labour government in the 1940s in Britain created the National Health Service, a socialized medicine system, and at the same time were brutally putting down colonial rebellion so they could continue extracting capital and using cheap labor. Couldn't agree more, Sarah.
Yeah, I agree with both of those comments, but I would say there are concrete things we can do at the international level. One is limit the IMF's power through quota reform. The U.S. is not the largest economy in the world, and it's resisted changing international institutions to reflect that because they want to keep the amount of power that they have. And then I'd also say that, you know, when we look at any of these issues, other countries take positions that make more sense. China helps out Venezuela and Iran and a lot of other countries because they have the power to. The U.S. is engaging in a full-scale propaganda war against China. And I think it's important for everybody to try to evaluate that fairly and recognize that China getting more power is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that, even on the left, some people think that the U.S., declining in the world is a bad thing, and it just isn't. I think that's you can look at what these countries are doing and see that they're doing a lot better than the U.S.
Any other thoughts on this? So there's a lot of discussion about like who to target, going back to that question. Carl, who is in the local internationalism group and also the National Anti-War Subcommittee, has pointed out that going forward, the National Committee is talking specifically about targeting members of the Progressive Caucus that did not sign the Omar AOC letter. Dee wants to know, is it possible to get the NPC to issue NPC is the National Political Committee of DSA. They are between conventions, highest decision-making body, to issue a national campaign call against all U.S. sanctions, especially against Iran and Venezuela. I'm not on the NPC. I don't think anyone here is. I do know in the past they have, called to lift the sanctions against Iran. They did some pretty good stuff around Venezuela. So I feel like they've sort of done that. Wouldn't it be good to target MBS in Saudi Arabia? So more stuff on the good sanctions, bad sanctions debate. Sarah Lazar put very well. I don't know what you put very well since it was 10 minutes ago, but I have no doubt that it was. African National Congress supported the sanctions against South Africa. From Medea, Other ideas we can put to the media to cover these issues include our viewpoint. We can fund groups working in those countries. We at Code Pink have a fund project in Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba. Here's the link. I meant to say put pressure on the media. Okay, more discussion of strategy. The Washington Post editorial board has called for loosening sanctions against Iran, but is totally in sync with sanctions against Venezuela, as far as I can see. That's an interesting dichotomy. And then Caleb said, can anyone go more in depth about Saudi UAE stances and lobbying around this and what interests they're pursuing? Sarah, I feel like that's your beat.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like there are probably a lot of people on this call who could answer that. I'll actually let someone else start off answering it. Yeah.
So the question is, can anyone go more in depth about Saudi UAE stances and lobbying around this? What interest are they pursuing?
So, okay, I guess I'll start out by saying that so Saudi Arabia and UAE, for the most part, want the US to be really aggressive towards Iran, and are in a kind of de facto alliance with Israel on that, and more so an open alliance. And it's actually interesting if you go through FARA documents. Those are documents that if you're sort of, what's the most concise way to describe it? That you have to register if you're acting as a paid agent of a foreign government in a way that's aimed at political influence in the US. So you can actually look through FARA documents looking at like, who do UAE lobbyists contact the most? And I've gone through, there are a handful of prominent UAE sort of lobby shops in the US, and they really aggressively court pro-Israel organizations. And FARA docs are very incomplete, which is unfortunate and which is its own sort of area of desperate need for greater transparency. But if you look at FARA docs, you can definitely see stuff like, you know, met with this pro-Israel organization, meeting between UAE lobbyists and pro-Israel organization, and we discussed Iran, or we discussed the war in Yemen, which is often framed as a proxy war with Iran, even though Iran's role is almost always overstated in the US press. So those are a few examples of sort of how the UAE and Saudi Arabia weigh in. They also, you know, so Brian Katulis, who I mentioned before, who works for the Center for American Progress, he is very close with the UAE lobby. He used to organize delegations to the UAE with US lawmakers. His separate job is he works for Albright Stonebridge, like global mercenary firm. They're really shady. They're kind of like McKinsey and Company. Albright is named after the Madeleine Albright. And they have offices in Riyadh and the UAE. So, you know, the papers that I read you that Brian Katulis wrote, you should understand that those positions come from someone who's very close to the UAE lobby. So it can give you one small window into sort of what they're pushing for.
Yeah, and you've written a lot about FARA docs and lobbying.
And I'm seeing the note from Code Pink about how UAE is now calling for lifting sanctions on Iran. So actually, before this call, I was actually going through FARA docs, where UAE is actually now heavily involved in efforts to push back on accusations that it has violated US sanctions on Iran. So it's a little complicated, and what I just said is not cut and dry, but those are the broad brush strokes as they've been for a while.
Any other thoughts on that question and any other questions? We don't have any more questions oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was just really quick on the UAE thing. They I think their tune changed because the U.S. slapped sanctions on a few of their companies for importing Iranian oil last month. So I think they realized it's now at a disservice to them. And then, yeah, we're talking about like what interests, Saudi Arabia is pursuing. And if you look at the export rate and production rate of Saudi Arabia after the maximum pressure campaign, it's a pretty naked material interest there. I wanted to briefly.
Sorry to just jump in.
Yeah.
Just to jump in really fast. Like now the UAE is hiring the same lobbyists who have been pushing for Iran sanctions to like defend it against accusations of violating Iran sanctions for oil.
Yeah. I wanted to respond to something I saw in the chat in the good sanctions, bad sanctions. Someone mentioned the UN and their role in sanctions, and I just wanted to. I didn't know this until kind of recently after I started looking into this, but I mean, what the US is doing is not considered sanctions under UN law, meaning the only sanctions that the UN recognizes as sanctions are done through the UN Security Council. Those are what they call sanctions. Everything else, like the US is doing, is considered a unilateral coercive measure. So when UN speak, what the U.S. is doing is something that is against, the UN Charter and various other treaties that the U.S. is a signatory to. So I just think that's kind of an interesting thing. But at the same time, I don't think all UN Security Council sanctions are good. There's obviously the power imbalance on the Security Council, and that's a huge problem for many reasons. Because like we talked about Iraq and with North Korea right now, especially, I believe there are UN sanctions that are technically allowed through the UN Security Council that violate their own principles, treaties, charters within the human rights bodies. And I will post a link if people are more interested in human rights or the UN aspect. They have a special rapporteur. His name is the Special Rapporteur on the Negative Impact of the Unilateral Coercive Measures on the Enjoyment of Human Rights. Idris Jazari. It's a mouthful, but I'll post it in the chat. You can go there and you can see like all of his reports that he's done as Special Rapporteur and the ways that they violate UN treaties and UN Charter and sort of like that legal argument to that. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Okay, we have another very specific DSA structure question. What is the relationship of Venezuela Solidarity Committees of DSA and anti-war working groups? Are they subcommittees of DSA? Are they separate groups? So there was a national Venezuela Solidarity campaign in DSA when Trump was ratcheting up intervention and around the embassy. It was started by a member of the International Committee, but I don't believe it ever had any official status. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong. I think Caesar is still on the call.
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct. Yeah. So DSA members are allowed to self-mobilize. We're not like a democratic centralist organization or top-down organization. So that was self-organized and very good. The anti-war subcommittee is a subcommittee of the International Committee, which I believe was formed before I joined the organization by the NPC. And I believe there's probably I was involved in the Venezuela Solidarity Working Group, and now I'm on the anti-war committee. So I think that's the relationship between those two. A lot of Davids in this chat. A different David has a question. Aside from opposing sanctions, how best can we combat the notion that countries that aren't U.S. allies, client states, are a significant threat to Americans? Anyone?
I can try if nobody else wants to chime in. I think that the U.S. is changing the playbook somewhat, but these are all things that have happened in the past. Specifically like lying about what countries are doing, lying about what the U.S. is doing. it's sort of our responsibility to try to get better information, to look at primary sources from these countries, to talk to people in these countries. There have been a lot of Venezuela solidarity trips, Cuban solidarity trips. I think those are very useful. I would really like to see many more Chinese solidarity trips, and more engagement with China. I think that understanding is very important to seeing the rest of the world as equals, and to sort of dispel some of the, really blatant propaganda that gets promoted by the U.S. as truth. And also seeing the effects of U.S. policies on these countries is very important.
I think that right now in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, we are really seeing an example of how the U.S. is willing to pursue belligerence, even when that belligerence puts the whole world at greater risk, including the United States. I think this is actually a really big opportunity to sort of question the whole premise of national security. So, we should primarily be concerned about people suffering under sanctions regimes because those people matter, and, where you happen to be born does not, should have no bearing on how important every single life is. And, we should be embracing ideas of radical equality. And also, on top of that, even if all you care about is self-interest, this is a globally connected pandemic. An outbreak anywhere makes the whole world more vulnerable. And the US is willing to pursue this belligerent policy, even to the point of making everyone in the whole world more vulnerable. So I actually, I think that we're going through such a traumatic crisis event that is really exposing America as a sham in so many ways. Nearly 10 million filing for unemployment in the last 2 weeks, a society that has no safety net, and that is in the middle of this pandemic mobilizing to make the crisis worse for other people in a way that's hurting them and hurting us. I don't know. I guess I hope that what can come out of this moment that we're in is some real transformation in how we think about the United States, I hope the left wins the battle of ideas once we pull through this.
Excellent. Any last questions from anyone? If not, I'll ask the panelists if they. Okay, yes, the anti-war subcommittee is a subcommittee of the International Committee. I don't really feel like the Socialist Night School is the best spot to, when we have panelists, to try to map out the DSA structure. So any other questions? If not, I'm going to go on to asking our panelists if they have any final thoughts, and then I'll give an announcement about our next night school.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the work everyone's doing. It's really important stuff that y'all are doing.
Anyone else have a final thought?
Yeah, again, yeah, thanks everyone for participating, and thanks for having this. I know it's unfortunate that it's a pandemic that's bringing about this conversation, but I really do think the conversation around sanctions is really gaining much more notice by a lot of surprising voices as well. But I think us trying to organize from the left, I think now that because it's a national conversation, I think there's a little bit more room there. And I think people are starting to get it. And I would just like to encourage everyone to, take this stuff and talk to people in your organizations. And I'm really hoping we could expand the conversation, because it's all about Iran right now. And I have, a lot of personal connection with that, but I want to expand it to all sanctions, Venezuela, North Korea, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Sudan. There's a lot of places And I think, yeah, if we can keep expanding that, yeah, and to, you know, your friends who are on the left, you know, just kind of reiterate that if you do want to have, you know, international working class solidarity, when you cripple, you know, the main industries of a country and the main form of employment, you're not only hurting them economically, but you're really closing the space from which they themselves can organize as well. I think in Iran, that's a big case. There was a lot of good forward momentum and traction, organizing in a lot of these, you know, steel factories and whatever, and which is a key industry in the car industry. And U.S. sanctions have really suffocated that movement. It has blowback effects by, you know, hardening kind of the right-wing voices in those countries, which then, you know, trickles down to hurt workers. So yeah, thank you all. I enjoyed this immensely.
Kevin, Elliot, final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just echo what Sarah said about the U.S. posture and belligerence during this pandemic, and how you know, striking that is, and it should be a lesson to the entire world. And somebody mentioned emergency loans. The U.S. is blocking those. The IMF also has the ability to basically generate money called special drawing rights, and they could give these out to a bunch of different countries to give them foreign exchange. But the U.S. is, from what we know, blocking that because it would also give Venezuela and Iran money. So they're looking for a way to exclude them. You know, and I saw the other day the U.S. violated its own sanctions to import Russian ventilators. So the U.S. is basically, you know, doing a bunch of different things that I think show how it actually acts in the world all the time. We need to start looking towards solutions, either other countries, you know, taking a more active role, which we've seen from China, which has been heartening, developing a new global currency, and sort of as Americans changing, or as a lot of people on this call are Americans, I imagine, changing our perspective toward the rest of the world.
Elliot?
Thank you to everyone for joining. And I learned from listening to Sarah, Kevin, and Kavan. I'm glad to be here. I always want to remind myself and everyone else that imperialism and capitalism go hand in hand together, and you cannot get rid of one in the United States and around the world without getting rid of the other. Hope to have continuing conversations and see all of you coming out to do the work, either with Metro DC DSA, other DSA chapters and branches around the country, or the many other great groups that are doing this work. Thank you, everyone.
I want to thank all of our attendees and all of our panelists. This was a really great panel. Like I mentioned before, David and I started discussing the idea of doing a panel on sanctions in June. So this is a long time in the making, and COVID just made it, unfortunately, all the more relevant. I feel like with the International Socialist Night Schools, they're particularly important because we see so much propaganda in the media and so much just bad reporting. I mean, I think recently the Washington Post discovered, surprise, surprise, what happened in Bolivia may have been a coup. If they had come to our Socialist Night School with Kevin and other CEPR comrades, they would have already known that, actually. So I think it's particularly important when we take on topics like the coup in Bolivia, like the sanctions, like the plight of the Palestinians, like U.S. policy towards North Korea, that this is a very important institution, because just the sheer breadth of like bad information out there is just overwhelming. International topics are a very small part of what we do at the night school. The Socialist Night School is designed as a series of introductory presentations for people who presume no background knowledge. So like, if you want to learn more about like, who's this Karl Marx guy, but you're not quite sure, the best, we want to start off with like a debate about, is the law of the tendency of the rate of the volume, or rate of the profit to fall, outlined in volume 3, Marx's sole theory of crisis, or just one of many criteria. Maybe that's not the end. This is your space. This is our 4th semester. This has so far been our only all online semester. It's a brave new world. Last week was Marxism. What is Marxism? Week before was what is socialism? Our next event is Tuesday, April 14th, 2020, 6:30 p.m. Also online. And it is on social reproduction theory, and it's going to ask such questions as, what is the connection between gender and class? Why must socialists be feminist and feminists be socialist? What does socialist feminist struggle look like? And to answer these questions, it's going to look at, as the name would suggest, social reproduction theory. And social reproduction is the question of how workers are produced in order to keep capitalism surging along. Obviously, women are disproportionately given the task of social reproduction. So it's a very important Marxist feminist theory. I hope you join us. And I thank all of you who were here.